I'm Robert Vamosi, and by day I'm an analyst at Javelin Strategy and Research, where I do security risk and fraud for the financial services industry. I'm also a blogger at Forbes.com. I'm a contributing editor at PC World Magazine. I write a monthly security column for Windows Secrets, and I do a couple other things on the side. I've also written a book, which I'll get to in a moment. This is of Bytes and Bullets. This is the authors panel here at DEFCON 18, and I'm joined today by Joseph Menn, Jeffrey Carr, and Robert Knake, and they've all written books, and in a few moments they'll get the chance to talk about their books. My book hasn't come out yet. It'll come out in March of 2011. It's called When Gadgets Betray Us, the dark side of our infatuation with new technologies. And it's basically a real-world look at hardware hacking. And to give you an example, in Chapter 1, I start talking about how criminals are using laptops to steal cars. And I use a very real example of a gentleman named Radko Susik, who is in the Czech Republic. And when he was 11, he started stealing cars using the traditional tools of a screwdriver and a pair of scissors. And around 2006, he switched over to a laptop because he found that he could get more cars quickly that way. And I published the story in 2007 and got a lot of blowback from the auto industry, particularly the insurance industry, that cited numbers saying that the car thefts were actually going down. So how could I explain that? Could you actually steal a car with a laptop? So I felt challenged to pursue that. Did it in fact exist? And there were a few things that I found along the way, and this is a good time for props, I think. So at the moment, most people have two ways of protecting their cars. One is the entry, the remote entry, where you press a button and your car doors pop open and car lights come on, a few other things. That's primarily made by key lock. And then you have the DST, which is in the key, and that's something for the ignition. It's got to be very, very close to the ignition in order to unlock the ignition, unlock the steering column, and so forth. So there's two things you got to crack. Well, it turns out in 2004, Johns Hopkins team cracked this. It's a 40-bit algorithm. So that was pretty much easy to do. And then in 2007, somebody cracked key lock. So you've got two cracks out there, and you've got somebody like Radko Susik out there with a laptop. Could he, in fact, do this by himself? Well, turns out it gets a little easier. We've moved away from having two of these now, where we just have one, and we have remote key and remote ignition, and you just press a button, and boom, the door opens, and a button lights up, and you can start the car. So once you figure out that code, you own the car. So I think that's what's happening, and we did see some real examples of that. There's a case where David Beckham, the soccer star, had two BMW X5s stolen off the streets of Madrid, one in broad daylight, and it's widely suspected that a laptop was used to steal the car. So there have been some examples of that. And then in the book I look at other more personal examples, because really this is gadgets that we use every day and affects us very deeply. And just briefly I'll go to the one that affects us near and dear to many of our hearts, and that is medical devices. There are movements now to move some of the electronic devices that we use in our bodies to the internet for calibration purposes, for remote diagnosis and whatnot, and they're not being secured properly. And so here it's kind of brilliant, because you can just throw a piece of garbage at it and it's enough to defibrillate the pacemaker and send the heart into arrhythmia, and if it's not corrected soon, it can lead to death. So there's some very real consequences. Now, who might be interested in doing something like that? Well, certainly organized crime could do that. You could target, say, the CEO of a large computer company that hasn't declared a successor, and you could go after that individual and threaten to disrupt any medical devices in his body. You could even charge a ransom for that. That would be something for a criminal enterprise to do. And then certainly you could have a rogue nation state go after political leaders who are known to have these devices in their bodies. So there's some real consequences to not paying attention to hardware hacking, and I bring them out in my book, and as I said, it'll come out in March of 2011. So to talk more about some of the criminal organizations and what they're doing and rogue nation states, I'll turn it over to the panelists. I'll start with Joseph.
Hi, thanks a lot. So I'm Joseph Menn. I've been a mainstream newspaper reporter for 20 years. And I must be doing something right because I'm still employed. And my book is called Fatal System Error: The Hunt for the New Crime Lords Who Bring Down the Internet. It came out a few months ago, so it's gotten very well received. And I've been covering tech security since '99, and I've always felt that smart people like the folks here know what's going on, and even some people in Washington understand what's going on. But one of the many reasons that cybersecurity is so terrible is that the general public has no idea what's going on. And part of that's because it's genuinely complicated technologically, and as I found out, politically and legally. But in part it's because nobody has an incentive to explain it. You know, the software companies want you to buy their stuff, and computer companies want you to buy your stuff, and the banks want you to do stuff online because it saves them money, and so forth and so on. And so what I worked for years to do was to try and find an adventure story, a true adventure story of good guys and bad guys that would cut through that, and so I could educate people in a fairly painless, I hope, fashion. This my quest began in like 2003 when I was at the LA Times. And that's when, as most of you probably know, viruses became really commercial, and it was a really major change. And initially, that was because the spam block lists were working, and so they wanted lots of bots to send spam from safe IP addresses. But probably the second easiest thing you can do once you have a botnet is DDoS folks, So one of the first things that they did was, and they is in this case Russian organized crime, the other folks are doing it, was DDoS extortion. And they would start knocking over websites and say, you know, please to send $40,000 to Latvia by Western Union, you can have your site back. And I like this because this showed that it was, okay, this is serious organized criminal activity that's now taking over, is responsible for a lot of the bad stuff on the internet. And my grandmother, can understand somebody knocking over a website. I don't have to go into 0 days. I don't have to talk about patch cycles. That people can understand that. So I called the first companies that were getting knocked over, and as it happens, they were offshore gambling sites directed largely to U.S. customers. Which seems weird. I mean, why would a mob pick on another mob? It doesn't seem like it's sensible, but it is sensible because they had generally poor bandwidth, they are cash rich, and they are highly unlikely to go to the FBI for help, seeing as the FBI thinks they're a bunch of crooks. So I called those guys and to try and make my story better and even more readable, and I was looking for human beings to put around it, and they said, well, you should talk to this guy Barrett Lyon. He really saved our ass. And Barrett Lyon was, well, I didn't know him at the time. I called him. I assumed he'd be some boring 40-year-old white guy surrounded by PR people that wouldn't let him say anything interesting. But I asked if he'd come to my office, and he said, yeah, sure. And he was 25. He's wearing flip-flops and shorts, totally unassuming. And so I said, okay, so tell me how you warded off the denial of service attacks. And he told me some stuff about, the scripts he wrote and the additional bandwidth that they glommed on and everything else. And I said, well, try to make the story a little better. I said, well, did you learn anything about the attackers? And he said, yeah, I chatted with them. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. I traced back some of the. As it turns out, a lot of the bots were running SNMP with the default configuration, so that I could trace back where they're getting their traffic, where they're getting their orders from. And I joined this IRC channel in Kazakhstan, and I pretended to be a bot writer. And I was thinking, why are my bots connecting to your channel? What's going on? What's happening with the code? And maybe I can help you and combine forces. I said, wow, that's pretty interesting. You didn't get their actual names, did you? Yeah, I actually got one. And over a couple months, pretending to be a bad guy, he developed a rapport with some of them. And one of them screwed up and let out his real IP address when he did a file transfer over IM. And then he'd made a couple other screw ups, and he got his actual name. So I said, wow, well, I don't suppose law enforcement cared, did they? And he said, well, the FBI, not really, but England sent somebody to Russia for 3 years to chase these guys. I said, really? And the story just kept getting better and better. So I wrote a big front page story about him. And then later, I checked in with him, and he'd gotten out of the business in kind of an interesting way. What had happened was that the gambling guys thought he was so wonderful that they paid to set him up. They invested in a new business called Prolexic Technologies, which is still around, still doing DDoS mitigation. He checked back with the bots after a couple years in this business, protecting blue chip companies. And the bots were no longer doing DDoSes. They were sucking dry financial information, and the same bad guys were doing mass identity theft. So he couldn't really protect against that because they're going after consumers, and he's like a business infrastructure guy. The other thing that happened was around the third time that he had to meet payroll by going to a parking lot of a drugstore and meeting a guy named Vinny who had a manila envelope full of 20s, he thought maybe his investors weren't such great people either. So in the manner of Bridge Over the River Kwai, he went back to the FBI and said, you might want to take a look at my own guys. And he wore a wire against people who were backed by the Gambinos. And the book outs him for what is essentially a subplot, so props to him for that. He's still alive. He has a good alarm system. So that's the first half of my book. The second half is what happened in Russia and the British agents they sent over there, and it's really dramatic. And it's a happy story because they actually got 3 of these gang members, and they're in jail now for 8 years, which never freaking happens. And I got really lucky because the British never put out a press release about it. And the guy is like, he came back with one of the wonders of the criminal justice world, and they locked it in a warehouse like Raiders of the Lost Ark. The reason was that his agency, which was these really great investigative guys, got taken over by some other agency, and they were ex-intelligence guys and didn't believe in telling anybody anything. But anyway, when he was over in Russia, the bad guys tried to kill him. They threatened to kill the judge. They tried to bribe the judge. And like I said, that's what we creative types call a narrative arc with a happy ending. But it's all a trick. The real point of the book is why he couldn't go further upstream. And not to spoil too much of it, but shockingly, very, very bad guys are protected by Russian intelligence, in part because they're used for cyber war in places like Estonia and Georgia. It's the same servers, it's the same people, it's the same everything. I mean, the garden variety corruption in Russia is absolutely mind-blowing. You can't really understand it unless you've been there. But this is beyond that. This is military state policy. I'm sort of happy that I think there are things in Washington that are starting to address this. But anyway, a friend of mine at Google said the book is a public policy document disguised as a crime caper, which I like, because it's this fun plot, which happens to be all true. It's investigative journalism. And then towards the end, I get to state sponsorship, and then the last chapter is all policy proposals and stuff like that. And that's what I got. Jeffrey?
Oh, all right. My name is Jeffrey Carr. I wrote Inside Cyber Warfare, Mapping the Cyber Underworld. It was a book that was spawned from the Russia-Georgia War of 2008. My background was originally at Microsoft working on their business intelligence platform, and I have always been interested in data mining and semantic analysis of unstructured text, and basically just trying to mine the web for little nuggets, little jewels of information in a sea of words, mostly having to do with national security. So because Microsoft wasn't interested in anything like that because it wouldn't make them any money, I went ahead and continued the research on my own, wrote a blog called Intel Fusion, and unbeknownst to me, it became a popular blog within the intelligence community. And then when I started writing about the Russia-Georgia War, in my opinion, which was contrary to what was normally being written about, which was that this was a landmark example of how Russia conducts its cyber warfare operations. I was offered the use of an intelligence platform called Palantir, and I thought, well, why waste it just on me? I might as well try to enlist lots of people to use this platform and see if a bunch of motivated people with nothing but open source tools could uncover a link between the Russian government and these Russian hackers. So that's what we called it Project Grey Goose, named after the French vodka, because I thought it was funny if we named a project looking into Russian hackers after a French vodka and not a Russian vodka. And the project went very well. We produced a couple of reports, and out of that, I wrote this book. The book really discusses a lot of what Joseph just mentioned, although actually none of the details of what Joseph just mentioned. But the underlying principle is that Russian organized crime maintains, and innovates upon a platform which the Russian intelligence services can utilize from time to time through the use of what we would call plausible deniability, and initiate cyber operations that would ensure the continued success of the power of the current president and prime minister against opponents within Russian Federation and against member states of the Commonwealth of Independent States.